The wind was a blade against Alara's cheek, honed sharp on the gray stones of the mountains and tasting of imminent snow. It tore at the thin wool of her shawl, a useless gesture of modesty against a cold that had already seeped into her bones. Before her stood Jedediah, her late husband's brother, a man whose piety was as thin and hard as the ice forming on the water trough. His face, ruddy and self-satisfied, was the final judgment in a trial that had been waged against her since the day her sixth daughter drew breath. 6 daughters. A field of flowers where a stand of timber was needed. A blight. Curse. The words had been whispered first, then spoken in council, and now delivered as verdict. Behind her, huddled by the door of the cottage that was no longer hers, were the 6 reasons for her ruin. Ada, the eldest at 14, her face a pale, stoic mask that mirrored Alara's own, holding tight to the hand of little May, who was just 3. Between them stood Lena, Beth, Sarah, and Tess, a staircase of quiet fear, their eyes wide and dark in the unforgiving light. They were good girls, strong and clever and kind, but they were not sons. In this hard land, that was the only sin that mattered. "The council is agreed," Jedediah announced, his voice carrying with the unearned authority of a man who has never known true hardship. "The allotment cannot sustain you. It is a drain on the family, on the community." Alara's gaze swept over the small, huddled community that had gathered to watch her shaming. Faces she had known her whole life, women she had helped in childbirth, men whose barns she had helped raise. Now they stood as silent witnesses, their expressions a mixture of pity, relief, and a chillingly righteous agreement. They were afraid that her misfortune, her barren fertility, was a contagion that might spread. Better to excise the limb than risk the whole. "Where are we to go?" Alara's voice was a dry rasp, the words torn from a throat constricted with a grief so profound it had no room for tears. She had wept them all out in the long nights, listening to the accusations seeping through the thin walls of her home. Jedediah gestured vaguely toward the vast, indifferent wilderness that pressed in on their small settlement. "The Lord provides for the sparrow. You must put your faith in providence." His words were hollow, a piety used to justify cruelty. He was taking her husband's land, the small plot of earth they had bled and sweat for, and cloaking the theft in Scripture. The desperation was a physical thing, a cold stone in her stomach. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair, threaded with gray, across her face. She saw not the endless forest, but the faces of her daughters, pinched with hunger, their small bodies succumbing to the first deep frost. This was not a banishment. It was a death sentence, delivered with a prayer. The world narrowed to the sound of May's quiet whimpers and the crushing weight of utter, absolute aloneness. The raw, desolate landscape was a reflection of her soul, stripped bare and left to perish. A silence fell, thick and heavy with unspoken finality. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable now that the sentence was passed, eager to return to the warmth of their hearths and the security of their own families. Jedediah gave a curt nod, his duty done, already turning away. It was over. Then, a voice cut through the wind, low and rough as granite. "Enough!" The word was not loud, but it stopped everyone. It stopped Jedediah in his tracks, his hand halfway to his hat. It stopped the muttering of the onlookers. It even seemed to still the wind for a moment. Alara's head snapped up. From the edge of the clearing, leaning against the rail of the common paddock, a man straightened up. Silas. He was a man who lived on the periphery, a trapper and homesteader whose land bordered the wild, untamed territories. He kept to himself, spoke little, and was the subject of wary speculation. Some said he was running from a dark past. Others that he simply preferred the company of wolves to men. He was tall and broad, dressed in buckskin and furs that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. He pushed off the rail and began to walk toward them. His steps were deliberate, unhurried, yet each one fell with an unnerving certainty on the hard-packed earth. He paid no mind to the crowd, his gaze fixed, unwavering on Jedediah. He stopped a few feet away, and the air crackled with a new kind of tension. "This is family business, Silas," Jedediah said, his voice tight with bravado that failed to conceal a tremor of fear. Silas was not a man to be trifled with, and everyone knew it. Silas's gaze shifted, just for a second, to Alara and the 6 silent girls huddled behind her. His expression was impossible to read, carved from the same hard material as the mountains at his back. Then his eyes returned to Jedediah, and they were as cold and gray as a winter sky. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. "You've had your say," Silas growled, the sound a low rumble in his chest. He looked directly at Alara, past the man who had condemned her. He did not offer pity or comfort. His words were a command, stark and absolute. "You're leaving with me." Alara stared, uncomprehending. Fear, sharp and primal, warred with a desperate, burgeoning flicker of something she dared not name. He was an unknown quantity, a man of shadows and silence. To go with him was to trade a slow, certain death for a swift, uncertain one. Jedediah sputtered, his face purpling with indignation. "You have no right." Silas didn't even look at him. His eyes were still on Alara, holding her, demanding an answer without asking a question. He was offering a choice that was not a choice at all. It was a lifeline, rough and splintered, thrown into the abyss where she was drowning. Behind her, she felt Ada's small hand clutch the back of her dress. She looked at her daughter's face, then at the faces of the others, a chain of hope and terror. Whatever this man was, he was not the slow, sanctimonious cruelty of her kin. He was a force of nature like the coming storm, and like any creature seeking shelter, she had no choice but to run toward it. Taking a ragged breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, Alara gave a single, sharp nod. The journey to Silas's homestead was a long, silent procession through the thinning woods. He led the way, his stride long and even, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. Alara followed, herding her daughters before her like a flock of weary sheep. The girls, awed into silence by the towering, quiet man and the strangeness of their situation, walked with their eyes downcast, their small feet stumbling over roots and stones. Alara's mind was a maelstrom of questions. She watched his back, the solid set of his shoulders, the way he moved through the wilderness not as a visitor, but as something that belonged there. He had not offered a single word of explanation. He had simply gathered the worn satchels containing their few worldly possessions, loaded them onto his pack mule with an unnerving efficiency, and started walking. They walked until the familiar paths gave way to trails only he could see, until the sounds of the settlement were swallowed by the sighing of the pines. Alara's fear did not recede. It simply changed its shape. It was no longer the cold dread of abandonment, but the sharp, alert tension of uncertainty. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, sent a fresh jolt through her. Yet Silas seemed oblivious to it all. He was a bastion of calm, his presence so solid it felt as if the forest itself made way for him. He pointed out a patch of treacherous ice for the girls to avoid, his gesture simple, economical. He steadied Lena when she slipped, his large hand on her shoulder for only a moment before releasing her. Small things, actions, not words. His cabin appeared suddenly in a clearing, nestled against a rock face that shielded it from the worst of the wind. It was not large, but it was built of thick, dark logs, chinked tightly with mud and moss. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a thin gray ribbon against the darkening sky. It looked sturdy, safe. A wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost painful washed over Alara. Inside, a fire was already banked in the hearth. The single room was spare, masculine but clean. There was a rough-hewn table, a few stools, a bed built into the wall, and stacks of cured furs that filled the air with a musky, earthy scent. Silas swung the heavy satchels to the floor. "There's stew in the pot," he said, his voice still that low rumble. "And blankets in the chest." He gestured to a large wooden trunk against the far wall. Then he turned and walked back out the door, closing it softly behind him, leaving them alone in the startling warmth. The girls stared at Alara, their faces a mixture of confusion and relief. Alara moved as if in a dream, lifting the lid from the iron pot hanging over the fire. The rich smell of meat and root vegetables rose to meet her, a scent so comforting, so fundamentally good, that her knees felt weak. She ladled the thick stew into the wooden bowls she found stacked on a shelf. The children ate ravenously, silently, their earlier fear forgotten in the face of such immediate comfort. Alara ate too, the warmth spreading through her chilled body, fighting back the tide of questions that threatened to overwhelm her. Why? Why would a man like this, a man who so clearly valued his solitude, take on a widow and 6 daughters? There was no charity in him, she sensed. He was not a man moved by pity. It was something else, something she could not yet fathom. Days bled into a week. A routine, unspoken and unnegotiated, began to form. Silas was a creature of habit. He rose before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake them, and was gone for hours, tending his trap lines. He would return with game, a pair of rabbits, a brace of grouse, which he would clean and prepare with a practiced, blood-stained skill that made Alara's stomach turn. Yet she was grateful for the food. He showed Ada, her eldest, how to properly set a snare for snowshoe hares, his instructions brief and direct. He watched as Tess, the most inquisitive, examined the intricate patterns of frost on the windowpane, and later left a small, perfectly formed quartz crystal on the sill for her to find. He never spoke to the children directly unless necessary, yet he seemed aware of each of them, his presence a quiet, protective perimeter around their small, fragile world. He was building a wall of security around them, one silent action at a time. He chopped firewood and stacked it high against the cabin wall. He repaired the worn leather on Lena's shoe. He gave Alara a sharp skinning knife and a pile of pelts, saying only, "They'll need warmer cloaks." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact, an expectation that she would do her part. And she did. She cooked and cleaned, mended their clothes, and taught her daughters their letters by scratching words in the ash of the hearth. She began to feel the return of something she thought had been stripped from her forever: purpose. Slowly, tentatively, the tight knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. She still did not understand Silas, but she was beginning to trust the rhythm of his quiet decency. She was beginning to trust the safety he provided, even if she did not understand its source. The blow, when it came, was not unexpected. Alara had felt it looming, a shadow on the edge of their tentative peace. Winter had tightened its grip, blanketing the forest in a deep, silencing snow. It was in the quiet heart of an afternoon, while the girls were napping and a fragile quiet held the cabin, that the sound came, the crunch of heavy boots in the snow, the low murmur of male voices. Alara's blood ran cold. She moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the frost. It was Jedediah, and he had brought 2 other men from the settlement with him, their faces grim and determined. Silas was out on his lines. She was alone with the children. She moved swiftly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Ada," she whispered, her voice urgent. "Get the girls into the root cellar. Now, be quiet." Ada's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, her youthful face suddenly old with responsibility. She roused her sleeping sisters with gentle shoves and hushed whispers, herding them toward the trapdoor in the floor hidden beneath a bearskin rug. The heavy knock on the door sounded like a death knell. Alara took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and lifted the latch. Jedediah pushed past her, bringing the biting cold and the scent of self-righteousness into the warmth of the cabin. His eyes swept the room, taking in the stacked firewood, the drying herbs, the signs of a life being rebuilt. A sneer twisted his lips. "Living well, it seems, on another man's charity." "This is not your concern, Jedediah," Alara said, her voice shaking only slightly. A month ago she would have cowered. Now, standing in the shelter Silas had provided, a strange, defiant strength bloomed in her chest. "You are my concern," he snapped, taking a step toward her. "You and your litter." You are my brother's widow. Your shame is the family's shame. You will come back. The council has found places for the girls. Farms that need an extra hand. You will serve in my house, as is proper. He meant as a servant, a permanent reminder of her failure. Her daughters would be scattered, worked like beasts of burden. It was a fate worse than the one he had originally sentenced them to. No, Alara said. The word was quiet, but it was solid as stone. It was the truest thing she had ever said. Jedediah's face contorted in fury. You have no choice. He reached for her, his hand clamping down on her arm. Pain, sharp and biting, shot up to her shoulder. But before she could cry out, a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas stood there. He held no rifle. His hands were empty. He was covered in snow, his face stark and cold, but his eyes burned with a fire that seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. He had come back. He had somehow known. The two men with Jedediah took an instinctive step back. Let her go, Silas said. His voice was unervingly calm, a low growl that promised violence. Jedediah, emboldened by his companions, tightened his grip on Alara's arm. She comes with us. She is ours to deal with. Silas moved. It was not a rush, but a fluid, impossibly fast motion. One moment he was in the doorway, the next he was before Jedediah, his hand closing around Jedediah's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. Jedediah screamed, a high, thin sound, and stumbled back, clutching his broken arm, his face white with shock and pain. The other two men stared, frozen, at the sudden, brutal efficiency of the act. Alara looked not at her brother-in-law, but at Silas. In his eyes she saw not rage, but a chilling, absolute resolve. He was protecting his own. He took a step toward the remaining men. They flinched as if struck. This is my home, he said, his voice dropping even lower, each word a chip of ice. This is her home now, and these are her children. You are not welcome here. If I see any of you on this land again, I will not be so gentle. He did not need to raise his voice. The threat was absolute, written in the hard lines of his face and the memory of what he had just done. The two men, their courage shattered, practically scrambled over each other to help the whimpering Jedediah out of the cabin and into the snow, their retreat hasty and pathetic. The silence they left behind was vast. Alara stood, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her arm throbbing where Jedediah had grabbed her. Silas turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for injury. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second. Are you hurt? She shook her head, unable to speak. The terror of the moment was receding, leaving in its place a profound, earth-shattering wave of gratitude. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her, claimed them all not as property, but as part of his territory, his life. He had drawn a line in the snow and dared the world to cross it. She lifted the trapdoor. One by one, her daughters emerged, their faces pale. They looked at Silas, not with fear, but with a new, dawning awe. He was their protector, their strange, silent, fearsome guardian. He had faced down the monster from their old life and broken him. In the quiet aftermath, a new kind of world settled into place. The confrontation had shattered the last vestiges of Alara's old life, burning away the shame and fear that had clung to her for so long. The threat from the settlement was gone, replaced by the quiet, formidable boundary of Silas's protection. That evening, as the snow fell thick and soft outside, Alara tended to the scrape on Silas's knuckles, a small injury he'd sustained against Jedediah's jaw. He sat at the table, uncharacteristically still, and allowed her to clean the wound with a cloth dipped in warm water. Her touch was gentle, her movements precise. It was the first time they had been this close, a proximity born of shared violence and mutual defense. He watched her, his gray eyes tracing the lines of concentration on her face. My wife, he said, his voice quiet, breaking the long silence. She died, in childbirth. The boy, too, the words were stark, stripped of emotion, yet they held the weight of a long-carried sorrow. Alara's hands stilled for a moment. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw in their depths not just the hardness of a man who lived alone, but the hollowness of a man who had lost everything. She finally understood. He was not saving her from pity. He was rebuilding a home over the foundations of his own grief. In her and her daughters, this flock of discarded females, he had found a reason to fight the silence that had consumed his life. She finished her work, tying a clean strip of linen around his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. It was for more than just that day. It was for the food, the shelter, the warmth. It was for giving her back her dignity, piece by silent piece. He simply nodded, accepting her gratitude as he accepted all things, with a quiet solemnity. He flexed his bandaged hand. "The land is hard," he said, not to her but to the fire. "It takes, but it gives too, if you're strong enough to hold on." It was, Alara knew, the closest he would ever come to a promise. But it was enough. She looked across the room where her daughters slept, their breathing deep and even, their faces peaceful in the flickering firelight. Ada, the eldest, had a faint smile on her lips. They were safe. They were home. The stout woman, punished by her kin for her 6 girls, was gone. In her place was a woman who stood beside a strong, silent man, ready to face the bite of the wind. The world outside the cabin was still a vast, unforgiving wilderness, the winter long and deep. But for the first time since her husband's passing, Alara looked out into the snowy darkness not with fear, but with a fierce, resilient hope. They would hold on. Together.